Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu.
Good day for grilling in Washington. Welcome to the Thursday edition of Balance of Power with the Capitol transfixed today on dueling hearings, one for Fed nominee Stephen Miran, the other for RFK Jr., both devolving into a split screen of shouting matches. We'll unpack them both this hour. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kriti, Gupta in Washington. Thanks for being with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Things got pretty chippy in both of these sessions, Kriti, especially RFK Jr. with actual screaming into microphones. Stephen Miran, not so much yelling, but definitely a big disagreement with most Democrats on the panel.
Absolutely. This idea of Fed independence, which he says he really stands behind. The question is, he's still very supportive of Donald Trump's policies. You've seen him time and time again in almost every question back them. That's
right. We're going to go through this and unpack some of this with Bloomberg's Michael McKee. Also, insights from economist Claudia Sahm. I'll be curious to hear what she thinks about the way forward here with questions about whether he'll be at the next Fed meeting.
Well, and absolutely. And I'm going to put some of these theories, these economic theories, forward to her. Has she heard of them before, or is this the Miran doctrine? The Miran doctrine.
I like that. Later this hour, Dr. Leslie Kantor will be joining us from Rutgers University School of Public Health to get into this RFK debate. A lot of talk and yelling about vaccines, about health policy, and in some cases coming from Republicans. That was a pretty tough conversation with Bill Cassidy. We'll have to get back to that too.
It was a tough with Bill Cassidy, but Elizabeth Warren as well. I mean, always likes to steal the show.
That one we saw coming, as she told us last evening.
She told us last evening. We were warned. Plenty of heads up. I wasn't expecting the screaming match in return, though. And she made some crucial points that some would say even move the markets.
Well, let's get into all of that. In fact, we're going to start with the markets. Lisa Mathieu is in for Charlie Pellet at World Headquarters in New York. Lisa, how's it look?
Well, right now we have stocks on the rise, bond yields falling. This says traders increase bets on a faster pace of rate cuts by the Fed. Now, the S&P 500 pointing to a back-to-back advance. Right now, it's up about 0.3%, 24 points. We have the Dow up 0.4%, 195 points, and the Nasdaq up 0.3%, or 79 points. Over to the yield space, the 2-year 3.59%. That's down 2 basis points. The yield on the 10-year 4.17%, and that's down about 4 basis points. To currencies, we have the Bloomberg dollar spot index up about 0.2%. Japanese yen down 0.3% at 148.63 against the dollar. A few stocks on the move. American Eagle Outfitters, their shares soaring up nearly 35%. They said it expects a sales boost from marketing campaigns. You know them, featuring Sydney Sweeney and also Travis Kelce. Now, on the downside, newly listed software company Figma, their shares taking a hit, down 18%. Posted a double-digit rise in quarterly revenue, but profit missed expectations, and those shares are feeling the pain for it. And shares of GitLab, they are down about 9%, just about 9%. The provider of software development tools swung to a loss, but it raised its annual profit outlook. In other news for the company, its CFO, Brian Robbins, is leaving to join Snowflake. After the close, we have some more action from Lululemon, chipmaker Broadcom, also e-signature software company DocuSign. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, you can subscribe to Bloomberg News Now. Wherever you get your podcasts, I'm Lisa Mathieu. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Lisa Mathieu, live from New York. Thank you so much for the update here. Watching Wall Street as we watch the aftermath of the hearings, and the headline on the terminal says it all. Trump's Fed pick draws Democratic fire at confirmation hearing. Of course, we're talking about Stephen Miran, someone we've spoken with more than once on this program as chair of the Council of Economic Advisors in the White House. A lot of questions about Fed independence and the idea that this revolving door would keep swinging. One, by the way, that Miran himself criticized before, the revolving door between the Federal Reserve and the executive branch, knowing this is just a 4.5-month term that he's up for here. And he's not resigning his chairmanship. He'll be returning to the political position at the White House after this is done. So there are a lot of questions by Democrats, namely about Fed independence. And Senator Elizabeth Warren, who we just mentioned, she joined us last evening to give us a sense of where she was going in this conversation, went straight for Miran and his relationship with Donald Trump. Let's listen.
So let me ask you the question for the third time. We want to understand your independence. Donald Trump stated that the BLS faked the job numbers before the election to try and boost Kamala's chances of victory. Do you agree with that, yes or no?
The Bureau of Labor Statistics did not take corrective action to improve the quality of steadily deteriorating data.
Do you agree with the statement that they faked numbers?
I believe that they were complacently allowing the data to continue.
Do you have any evidence that they faked numbers?
Well, as I said moments ago, the data have steadily deteriorated in quality, and I'm happy.
Okay.
This, by the way, this approach was tried by several senators, several Democratic senators, including Chris Van Hollen. I'm pretty sure they never got an answer. Bloomberg's Michael McKee is in Washington to cover this hearing for us, our international policy and economics correspondent, and joins us live now from Capitol Hill. Did we ever get an answer to that question, Michael?
We never got an answer to that question, nor did we get an answer to the question of who won the 2020 presidential race, because Miran dodged that question as well from Elizabeth Warren. But basically, the Democrats pointed out the inconsistencies in his testimony and the inconsistencies with the paper he wrote last year that suggested major reforms at the Fed, including a 4-year prohibition on anyone going from the Fed back to a presidential administration. And obviously, he wants to go back after a 4-month hiatus at the Fed. He had no explanation other than it's a short term. So I would go back. But it was an effort by the Democrats to hold him accountable, and they probably did if the court of public opinion mattered. But in this case, it's the Republican senators on the committee who matter, and they basically gave Miran a pass on everything, and it looks like he will be reported out of committee to the Senate floor.
Mike, when it comes to that question of Fed independence, this kind of drum that Miran has been banging for quite some time, how does he suggest he can ensure independence?
Well, he sort of, he made the case that he would use his own economic training and his own beliefs to come to the conclusions he needed to about what monetary policy should be. He didn't separate what his own beliefs were from what the president's were. He was asked specifically if he believed in the president's views that he articulates so often on Truth Social about cutting interest rates, and he also danced around that question. So it's pretty obvious that Miran would go to the Fed as a reliable vote for the president, but one could make the case that there are reasons to vote for a rate cut, as Chris Waller and Mickey Bowman have said, and so it's kind of hard for Democrats to score too many points in that regard.
Well, so give us the real take, Michael McKee. The purpose of this exercise, knowing that we have a Republican majority, was this just about getting the poison out? Or will anything come from these clashes with Democrats? Is he as good as confirmed?
He's probably as good as confirmed. It's hard to believe that the Senate wouldn't vote for him, given that most of the members of the committee expressed their support, gave him softball questions, didn't seem to really care about anything that the Democrats raised. There were no follow-up questions from the Republican side. And the president has basically ordered the Senate to get him on the Federal Reserve Board by the time they meet September 17th. There are going to be calendar issues for the Senate floor action because they have a lot of nominations backed up. But if the president wants it, the Senate has shown they will give him what he wants.
Mike, you know me. You've known me for a while. You know I'm a markets girl at heart. So naturally, my favorite part of the testimony was when he was asked whether the bond market is pricing in or reacting to or considering the Fed independence is really at risk. Miran saying it's not, and that's not a real kind of scenario that would even show up. The natural follow would be, isn't that a done deal? Isn't Wall Street already saying Fed independence is not a thing anymore?
Well, it depends on whether you're in the administration or not. For Miran, he can say it's a theoretical question and I can't answer these hypotheticals because that hasn't happened. There are people on Wall Street who think Fed independence has been compromised, but we haven't seen a huge reaction in the markets. We've seen what may be the beginning of that, but right now it seems that the markets have made their peace with the idea of a 25 basis point cut, and that's keeping the long end pinned, the short end pinned down rather. The long end is exhibiting some concern, but not what you'd expect if they thought that the Fed had gone completely off the rails. That may still be out there.
Michael, it's great to have you in Washington, as always. Michael McKee, live from Capitol Hill. As we add the voice now of Claudia Sahm, we've been looking forward to this conversation in the wake of the hearing. Chief Economist, New Century Advisors. Claudia, it's great to have you back with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. What were your thoughts listening to this back and forth over Fed independence? Would confirming Stephen Miran for the board actually change the story here, knowing that he plans to go back to the White House?
So it was a pretty wild hearing. It lived up to expectations. This really wasn't about Stephen Miran and his ability to serve as a Fed governor. It was about Federal Reserve independence. And very specifically, what that means is who is in control of the interest rate decisions. Is it the president or is it the Federal Open Market Committee? Right? We're at, and that's this big question mark. And we've seen a whole series of events that have kind of pushed us in the direction of this White House really trying to exert a lot of control over interest rates. And to me, in Miran's hearing today, it is absolutely the case, and he said this as well, presidents, when they nominate someone to the Fed board, it's someone whose views they agree with, right? Like that, the president does have an influence on the Fed. This is not some pure, totally devoid of any political contact. But there was more to this confirmation. And what to me was the real shocker was the idea that the White House is going to send him to the Fed and keep him on staff at the White House, which, a pretty clear reading of the Federal Reserve Act says that is not okay, but it just fits within a series of actions that really are pushing us towards a Fed that's under the control of the president. And that to me, that action was one that really caused concern, not the back and forth about, he's been in politics and he'll be independent. Those are words. That's it.
Well, Claudia, if we can dive into perhaps some of the policy and some of the kind of proposals that he was suggesting that very much have aligned with what we've heard from the White House broadly. The one that stuck out to me is the fact that he said there is no inflationary effect when it comes to tariffs. He was pushed about whether tariffs are taxes. His response was any policy can be modeled as a tax on Americans. As an economist, is that true?
Yeah, see, this was part of the hearing that was really complicated in that, Miran right now is the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. He's part of the White House. Part of his job is to defend those tariffs, right? That is not, when he would be at the Fed board, that is not his deal. It's how do you react to these tariffs? It's not selling them. He got questioning time and again about these tariffs, and he got really very few questions, if any, about his views on monetary policy. What do you think the neutral interest rate is? What do you think? You're not going to have a political official stand before Congress and throw under the bus the president's key proposals, right? That was, Democrats were asking these yes, no questions to get him to, he's not going to do it. He's in the administration and he's also a presidential appointee, right? So I think, fine, whatever. He did a lot of hedging. He, tiptoed around issues. I didn't appreciate when he tiptoed around some that I thought were very directly about the Federal Reserve, but it was a strange hearing.
Well, Claudia, we are less than 24 hours away from a jobs report tomorrow. And I feel like the closest he got to discussing the labor market and even discussing those dynamics was talking about immigration. And he connected the dots between the immigration policy, the White House's border policy, and inflation when it comes to housing. Can you just connect those dots for our global and our political audience, frankly, about how that relationship should work in theory?
Right. So I think absolutely going into tomorrow's employment report, we should be thinking a lot about how much immigration policy has changed in the United States in just the last few years, because these big declines in immigration in the country, a rise in deportations, that should be showing up in terms of slower job growth because we have less labor supply. There can be other things going on, but that will almost certainly be present in tomorrow's numbers that we can't read it out easily. Miran was talking about the inflation effects, and here, he was highlighting the how fewer people coming into the country. There's less household formation. There's less demand for housing. So that'll help push down house price inflation. Totally fine. What he didn't mention is it's also the case that immigrants come, they work, they help deal with labor shortages and keep, wages from really exploding and then potentially have that passed on to consumers. So my read and what I think the, different Fed officials have talked about is on inflation, it's kind of a mixed bag in terms of exactly how immigration sorts itself out. In the labor market, it's pretty clear it's going to slow things down in terms of our workforce, which means it's pretty clear it's going to slow things down in terms of our growth as a country.
So, Claudia, from your perspective, we've heard from folks on both sides of the aisle. We heard from Elizabeth Warren on the show last night. We've heard from plenty of Republicans in the White House as well. Everyone's saying the economy is receding. Things are slowing down. Recession is right around the corner. From your perspective, where are we?
So I would agree that things are slowing down. I do not see a recession right around the corner. I am watching very carefully what's happening in the labor market, because that will be decisive and, whether things really start to go south quickly. There were several policies that, as we could expect to have slower growth from. I mean, those tariffs, they are a tax. And that slows things down, at least in the near term. Maybe far in the future they create production, but they're going to slow things down. It's a tax. We've had less immigration. That slows things down. We've had a lot of uncertainty. That slows things down. So it's a question of where do we go from here? Are these very temporary effects? Are they ones that deepen? So I think that's the question we're in right now. I see much slower growth than we've had in recent years. But I don't see the falling off the cliff, but I think it is appropriate for the Fed and everyone else to be watching that risk carefully.
Tomorrow's the first jobs report since President Trump fired the head of BLS. There was a lot of talk about the quality of data in this hearing today. Stephen Miran would not acknowledge questions, refused to answer questions about the political motivations that President Trump had ascribed to the head of the BLS. How are you going to look at the data tomorrow now that this has taken place, and will the markets second guess the number they see?
I'm going to look at the data like I always look at the data. This is the absolute best read that we have on the U.S. labor market. We have world-class statistics. Yes, they can be better. Anything can be better. But they will give us a good read. It's going to be complicated, but it is not complicated because our data are falling apart. It's complicated because the economy is complicated. When we have these moments where labor supply is moving one direction, labor demand's moving in, it's really hard to read the data. And so I think tomorrow I'm just going to be looking at lots of pieces, keeping an eye on the jobs numbers, keeping an eye on the unemployment rate, looking at wage growth. You really have to look at all these pieces. And, you never take one number and run with it. That's just how it works in terms of measurement. But I have no qualms about spending a lot of time sifting through the data and trying to answer the question of where are we headed? What's going on? Well,
you wonder in the coming months, we'll see how the Trump administration handles the data. If this sends more people to private research, if ADP starts to rise on your list of credibility here versus government data. I know it's already a cottage industry, but are more economists going to be looking at private research because of this?
The using other data sources has been a growing trend for a very long time. And that's not necessarily about data quality coming out of the federal statistics. It's also sometimes you want a more granular approach. You want more timely approaches. Those are just not things the government statistics have been able to offer because, frankly, they're cost prohibitive the way that they do their work. And so I have no problem with the going out. But the idea that we're going to be, I don't think we're not there yet, but any time that is spent trying to figure out are the government data fabricated or somehow that's just going to be such a waste of time. And we're not there yet. There's no reason to do that. But we really should recognize for what this is. This is going to undermine the federal statistics that we have that, while could be improved, are really very valuable. So I don't know. We're not in a good place. This is pretty risky.
Yeah. Keep this in mind at 8:30 tomorrow morning. Claudia, Sahm, what a pleasure to have you always on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thanks for the insights today following the Stephen Miran hearing. Chief Economist, New Century Advisors, and some food for thought ahead of tomorrow's jobs data. Of course, we'll have that live for you when it breaks at 8:30 a.m. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington alongside Kriti, Gupta, the Thursday edition of Balance of Power. Our panel's up next on Bloomberg TV and radio. We're in Washington, of course, where it's all going to happen in the Rose Garden a little bit later on today. We've got our eyes on the White House for a who's who gathering of high-tech executives, including Tim Cook, who's apparently already in the building from what we understand. First Lady Melania Trump holding an event about AI, and then they're going to stay for dinner with the boss, the likes of Mark Zuckerberg, Tim Cook, Sam Altman, all at the White House this evening talking about AI. And I'll be deeply curious to see if we get any other investment announcements following that conversation. It's the hearings, though, that we're spending time on here on Balance of Power. RFK Jr. before one Senate panel, Stephen Miran before another. Of course, the president's pick to hold a temporary role, a 4.5-month-long stint on the Federal Reserve Board. President talked about this and the idea of gaining a majority, as he put it, on the Fed, which is not exactly how this was designed, to, of course, affect his hopes to see lower interest rates. Here's how the president put it in the Oval Office.
We just put a very good man in one position. We might switch him to the other. It's a longer term and pick somebody else, but we're very happy with the person we have in there. And we'll have a majority very shortly, so that'll be great.
That was at the cabinet meeting, actually, that, by the way, stretched over 3 hours. Kriti, Gupta, the idea of a majority as if this is a legislative body, rubbing some people the wrong way at the Fed and in investment circles. That's not the way this was supposed to be.
Absolutely not. This questions the independence. The irony of the timing of all of this is that actually both sides of the aisle are actually aligned on the need for the actual policy changes. This Jay Powell and some of his colleagues that are the holdout.
Interesting.
And yet this has brought up this question of independence.
Well, that's true. Let's play it to the panel. Rick Davis is back with us, Bloomberg politics contributor, our Republican strategist and partner at Stonecourt Capital, joined today by Aisha Mills, our Democratic strategist, principal at Community Asset Management. Great to have you both with us here. Aisha, I don't know if this is something that moves the needle for you. A lot of people say, hey, who cares? It's Donald Trump. He says a lot of things. But this rhetoric does make some investors nervous, just about slowly chipping away the independence of the Fed, as he refers to having a majority as if it's the House of Representatives. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that everybody should be alarmed. I mean, we've been saying this since Donald Trump was elected, that he really does believe that he is the king of the United States as opposed to the head of a democracy. And that's a real challenge. I think that the markets, so far have been kind of, anxious, but holding a bit still, not sure how his tariffs, how his ultimate takeover and purging of the government was going to land, and how his unilateral decision making with his executive orders and otherwise were going to land. But we're ultimately going to see how problematic it is that he thinks that he can move his own agenda unilaterally by installing his people as if he is the only one in this country that is supposed to have control without, one, any common sense or real input from the experts who are tracking and following these issues all day long, every day, but then also really thwarting Congress most of the time, doing whatever he wants. It is a problem. We are in a democracy for a reason, because we need those checks and balances. And so, I hope that people start to put pressure on him to stop this craziness.
Rick, weigh in here, because not only are we keeping an eye on Stephen Miran filling on Adriana Kugler's seat, we also have one eye on the proceedings with Lisa Cook as well and the legality around her firing. What kind of precedent does the testimony today set for what we might be able to expect from Lisa Cook and the fallout there?
Yeah, I think the two of those things are quite different, and I would suggest that the Lisa Cook matter is much more disturbing to sort of official Washington than anything that's happening on the appointment side. I mean, the appointment side is running the track that you would expect it to be, right? I mean, the president has a vacancy; he's putting one of his own people in there. It's a little messy because nobody can tell. Is he still working in the White House? Is he going to work at the Fed? But you're unhappy with it, vote against him. You get the Senate gets to work their wisdom and will on this nomination. And otherwise, it's not a real shocking thing. What's shocking is that the president's taken extraordinary measures to remove a Fed governor. And that is very unusual. It's the first time it's ever happened. And I think more people are watching that to say, is this going to become a standard? If he gets away with this, that's real pressure on Fed governors, both at the Fed level and also in all these regionals. So the reality is that's much more a precedent-setting event. And of course, sure, that'll all be worked out in the courts. But even that process could give the president, if he wins on this, extraordinarily new powers to govern the Fed with an iron fist.
Realizing that delineation that you just made, Rick, do you have a problem with the idea that Miran's going to take an unpaid leave of absence as chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors and then go back to that job after 4.5 months? He's still going to have to answer to Donald Trump following whatever decisions he makes as a Fed board member.
Yeah, everybody I've talked to is sort of cynical about it. The Open Market Committee is going to do what they're going to do, and his presence on it is not going to likely change the outcome. So his entire tenure will see one Open Market Committee meeting, and then he'll go back to the White House. So, you know, people in Washington shrug their shoulders and say, so what? Yeah, it's an odd thing. It doesn't look good. If you're uncomfortable with it, vote against his confirmation. But the reality is he's a temporary, you know, and as much as you got to go through this process, just like you were going to be given a full tenure on the Fed, he's not, and he's not likely to be the president's pick, although he retains the option of leaving him there and extending his term. So to a lot of people in Washington, I think this one's much to do about nothing.
Aisha, weigh in here. What can Democrats do? We had Elizabeth Warren on the show yesterday. We were saying, what can you do to block any sort of moves here? And she said, look, I know I'm in the minority. What can Democrats do here to make even more of a stand?
Yeah, I mean, this is the reality of process, and the way that the legislative process works is that the Democrats are in the minority here. And so, you know, what they can do is they continue to do what they're doing, which all summer they were riling up their constituents and reminding the American public what is happening. That language of Donald Trump ruling with an iron fist, I mean, just that in and of itself should frighten everyone about what's happening in America right now. What Democrats can do is they continue to tell people that we have a president who is literally usurping any type of precedent, any type of norm, and certainly breaking the law in a lot of ways, and just kind of assuming that he has stacked the Supreme Court enough that they're going to let him get away with it. And we need to remind voters of that. Let's remember that midterms are coming up. Democrats are in the minority now, but Democrats need not be in the minority forever. And so what they need to be doing is reminding people what's happening, how horrific it is, the detriment to their lives. We're watching the healthcare conversation, or debacle, I should say, happen right now with Secretary Kennedy. And we're also seeing places like Texas and now Missouri try to rig the game with redistricting by calling a random off-cycle change in the way that the lines are drawn for representation so that they could try to stack Congress to keep Republicans in power. I mean, they're cheating at every pass. And that is the thing that Democrats have been talking about, and it's what they have to keep talking about while they're in the minority, and they don't necessarily have power to legislatively maneuver. They can absolutely change public perception about all that's happening and win back that power through the electoral cycle.
Big questions, Rick and Aisha, about President Trump's relationship with big business. And there's going to be an event that takes place a little bit later on today at the White House that everyone's watching. We're going to be trying to peer over the wall into the Rose Garden. Mark Zuckerberg, Tim Cook, Bill Gates, Sam Altman, Sundar Pichai. I could keep going, although Elon Musk is not on the list. Rick Davis. They're in town for an event that's being held by the First Lady focused on AI policy, but they're going to be having dinner with the boss later on. Will we get a flurry of investment announcements following this sit down with Donald Trump?
I wouldn't be surprised. We know that this president is sort of working the system to see where the United States government can take shares. And everyone there is either susceptible, vulnerable, or want to encourage that kind of behavior. I would say I just see this much more as a fundraising initiative. The president is a voracious fundraiser. He's raised almost $1 billion in the first year of his office. I don't know what records he was going to want to set, but he could set one tonight. So, you know, if I were looking at this, I would say probably much less to do with government policy on AI, probably much less to do with picking off shares in these companies, and much more to do with looking across the expanse of the billionaires seated at tonight's dinner and saying all these guys should be donors before the end of the month.
Aisha, talk to us a little bit about maybe the other side of the announcements we can expect here. Rick, they're talking about the investment piece. I'm more concerned about the tariffs that may or may not come in terms of the announcements. We're awaiting chip directions when it comes to chip tariffs, which a lot of these companies are, of course, exposed to as a key pillar of the Biden administration's policy as well. Walk us through the risks here, but also maybe what some of these tech CEOs can offer to maybe offset the impact of any sort of tariff policy coming down the pike?
The fact that we're even having this conversation about fraud, frankly, and abuse, and about tech CEOs currying favor in the White House with the president is such a problem. Guys, this is not a normal conversation. This is not the way that business as usual should flow in a democracy, and certainly not in the United States of America. The idea that the president is trying to, or I'm not going to say trying to, he's actually finding ways for the U.S. federal government to own shares and buy stock in these companies starts to reek a little bit like all of the things that we're upset about with China. Right? Because it's a state, these companies are owned by the state, and the state control, China owns and controls what direction these companies go. Well, now we're having these conversations as if they're, one-offs or set-asides about like the United States now having an actual equity stake in these companies. This is all really alarming to me because you've got a group of really, really wealthy people who are going to sit in a room and figure out ways to do more for themselves, to pad their pockets, to expand their businesses, to kind of compete globally in ways that, aren't really fair.
Aisha, I'm sorry, we're out of time. We're going to look forward to discussing this with you once we learn more about what the heck happened in this meeting. Aisha Mills, Rick Davis, our great panel, only here on Bloomberg. A dramatic day here in Washington. Welcome to the Thursday edition of Balance of Power. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kriti Gupta in Washington. Dueling hearings. We've been dealing so far with the hearing for Fed nominee Stephen Miran, but in a separate hearing room in the United States Senate today, the Senate Finance Committee, we found RFK Jr., the Secretary of Health and Human Services, in what was a very chippy conversation. In fact, downright confrontational, with yelling by some Democratic members and the secretary himself. If you look at some of the back and forths with the likes of Senator Elizabeth Warren, Mark Warner, who incidentally is going to join us in the late edition of Balance of Power, you'll know what I mean. But even some Republicans had words with Secretary Kennedy, including Bill Cassidy, a doctor, of course, from Louisiana. Shouldn't be a big surprise, but even John Barrasso, Wyoming senator, part of the leadership, got into this idea of vaccine policy and keeping promises that were made during his confirmation hearings. Let's listen.
Secretary Kennedy, in your confirmation hearings, you promised to uphold the highest standards for vaccines. Since then, I've grown deeply concerned. The public has seen measles outbreaks, leadership of the National Institute of Health questioning the use of mRNA vaccines, the recently confirmed director of Centers for Disease Control and Prevention fired. Americans don't know who to rely on.
Pretty important to be coming from that Republican in particular. We're going to be getting some insights from Dr. Leslie Kantor from Rutgers School of Public Health in just a moment, but we want to set the baseline and stay on Capitol Hill in a quick conversation with Bloomberg's health reporter Jessica Nix, who's in the Capitol for this hearing, which, by the way, just concluded about a half an hour ago. Jessica, it's great to have you on the beat for us here today. This was a bipartisan affair in questioning RFK Jr. Did he dispel any concerns about his approach to health?
That's a really great question. It didn't really seem like he did dispel any of those concerns from the Democratic side or even on the Republican side. One of the most interesting points of the entire almost 3-hour-long hearing was different Republicans who brought up Operation Warp Speed. Kennedy obviously has cut different contracts for mRNA vaccines, has said that he doesn't really trust mRNA vaccines in the past. Even Cassidy brought up, how would you even consider Operation Warp Speed a success for Donald Trump if you're saying this about mRNA vaccines? So we saw that rift within Republicans and Kennedy for one of the first times since Kennedy has taken on HHS secretary.
Well, Jessica, just to clarify for our audience, at the end of the day, does this policy or do these recommendations or views that he's making clear in Washington actually show up when it comes to when someone goes to a pharmacy and ultimately asks for a vaccine? Have we seen that trickle through just yet?
Yes, we have, specifically with COVID vaccines. If you remember a few weeks ago, the Food and Drug Administration changed COVID recommendations to just people who are 65 and older, or if you have an underlying condition. unless you have a prescription from a doctor. Then you're able to go to a pharmacy and possibly get that vaccine. But it's created a ton of confusion about where you can get the vaccine, if you can get the vaccine, if you can just go to your pharmacy like normal. And a lot of his decisions have also trickled down to important vaccine panels, specifically the one with CDC called the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or ACIP. They kind of set the tone for what insurance companies cover vaccines and also whether vaccines would be offered for free under different federally mandated vaccine programs. They're changing vaccinations as well and policy with vaccines too. They've got a meeting, very highly anticipated meeting coming up in literally 2 weeks, also to discuss the COVID vaccine, RSV vaccines, MMRV is also on the schedule, and then of course COVID, which is the one that everyone's very confused about right now.
Yeah, I know Senator Bill Cassidy was urging them to postpone that meeting. Jessica, it's great to have you. Many thanks. Jessica Nix, Bloomberg health reporter, live on Capitol Hill as we add the voice of Dr. Leslie Kantor, chair and professor at the Department of Urban Global Public Health at Rutgers University School of Public Health. Doctor, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's been some time, and it's good to have you back as part of our conversation. It feels to me like more questions were raised than answered in this hearing today. Do you agree?
I agree that it was a very contentious hearing. I think the thing that is very clear and very concerning for those of us who care about public health and the health of the American public is that we have essentially an HHS secretary who is decimating their own agency. What we know beyond the confusion that is being sown about vaccines is that thousands of CDC employees, even if we just stick with the Centers for Disease Control for a moment, thousands of people have been fired. We now do not have a director who is qualified at the head of the CDC, and we've had several high-level resignations of key scientists and leaders. So that is something that has certainly happened and was not resolved by today's hearing.
Doctor, can you just explore the hypothetical for me here? In the case of another pandemic or another wave or another variation of the COVID infection, what is the actual policy here? As you suggest, with the scientists, with the heads of these departments gone, what actually happens operationally to deal with a situation like that?
Yeah, well, you didn't have me here to terrify people, and I don't want to speculate too much on what another pandemic could look like. Obviously, that would be an extreme situation. And frankly, in terms of COVID, we got lucky because, in fact, the mortality rate was relatively low. If we did get hit with a disease that had a higher mortality rate, we know we lost millions of lives in the United States. It could be worse. But let's stick with what's happening right now, which is frankly bad enough, which is that we are losing in many communities what we used to call herd immunity, but we try to call community immunity for things like the measles. So we've had more than 2 times the number of measles outbreaks this year as we had even just a year ago. And 1 in 5 kids under the age of 5 who got the measles ended up in the hospital. So that is something that's happening right now without any further changes in policy. So I think we have to be very worried about a committee of now wildly unqualified people changing the vaccination schedule even more.
I want to ask you about Susan Monterez, who, of course, was at the head of the CDC and was fired by RFK Jr. There was a conversation in this hearing today about why. And I first want to mention the fact that ahead of this hearing, Monterez wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. Those seeking to undermine vaccines, she writes, use a familiar playbook, discredit research, weaken advisory committees, and use manipulated outcomes to unravel protections that generations of families have relied on to keep deadly diseases at bay. Once trusted experts are removed and advisory bodies are stacked, she writes, the results are predetermined. That is not reform, it is sabotage. RFK Jr. today talked about the need to fire Susan Monterez because she lied to Americans when she said she was fired for refusing to adopt or endorse vaccine recommendations that were not supported by science. Did she deserve to be fired?
Of course not. And what's ironic here is that for the first time in our history, the director of the CDC actually went through a Senate confirmation. And many people were skeptical about Dr. Menarez and whether she would just rubber stamp some of these unscientific changes to particularly vaccination policy. When she would not do that, RFK tried to fire her. He's not actually authorized to do that, and the White House followed up. You have multiple high-level career scientists who are saying the exact same thing. There's absolutely no reason to doubt Dr. Menarez's explanation, and I think that she is pointing toward exactly what has happened here. Secretary Kennedy has started an organization and has been a vaccine skeptic and underminer for a long time now. And he now has a much larger bully pulpit and, in fact, is overseeing, ironically, the organizations that make vaccine policy for this country. I think, like most of my public health and healthcare colleagues, 20 leading organizations today asked for him to step down, including the American Public Health Association, and I am certainly in agreement with that being what would be most appropriate given the actions of the last couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Kantor, we've seen that skepticism manifest most realistically and in real time when it comes to the COVID vaccines. But can you just walk us through the other places of the healthcare policy that is in the United States right now where you are starting to see that show up?
Sure. I mean, I mentioned one already, which is in the measles outbreaks and the worries that people have about the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. I think COVID is a very important place that we know that many people do remain vulnerable, including people like healthy pregnant women. And the American Academy of Pediatrics actually has now broken with the new guidelines from the federal government and said that children up to age 2 absolutely need to be vaccinated. So that is another place. And I think more and more we are hearing about parents who've heard a lot of this rhetoric opting their children out of certain vaccines. I think the most concerning public policy development was out of Florida yesterday when they announced that for any vaccines over which the Florida Health Commissioner has jurisdiction, which is not all of them, they will no longer be required for schools. So I just want to remind people that vaccines are not just about individual immunity. We need a large proportion of people to get them, or else a disease can take hold in a community.
Mm-hmm. But Dr. Kantor, if I went to a CVS or a Walgreens across the street, would I be able to get a vaccine if I asked for it?
Depends what state you're in. So, for example, I'm coming to you from New Jersey, where I'm very proud to say that many pharmacies are continuing to make COVID vaccines available to anybody who is eligible and without a prescription. In some states, they are requiring people to have a doctor prescription. Some states are working to make sure that their head of the State Department of Health can act as that sign-off doctor. But then there are sets of states where pharmacies believe that they're going to have trouble getting reimbursements, and they've announced that they are not going to make COVID vaccines as available. So this is becoming not just 2 Americas, but potentially 50 Americas, where your access to the vaccine may depend on your own state and their ability to develop workarounds.
50 Americas. We could invoke that vision on so many days here on this program. Doctor, thank you for being with us. Dr. Leslie Kantor, Chair Professor, the Department of Urban Global Public Health at Rutgers University's School of Public Health. Really interesting conversation. We're going to continue to unpack this hearing with RFK Jr. on the late edition of Balance of Power, in a conversation you will not want to miss with Senator Mark Warner. The Democrat from Virginia loomed large in that conversation as voices were raised specifically over the COVID-19 vaccine warp speed and the number of people who died in this country. The secretary refused to give the senator a number. Kriti Gupta will be with us as well, right here on the fastest show in politics. We'll meet you 5 p.m. Eastern time for much more from the nation's capital. I'm Joe Mathieu. This is Bloomberg.